Okay, gang, hello, how are you? Today we're going to talk about essay and paragraph structure, and specifically, we're going to get into some strategies for development. Like some of the previous presentations, we're going to start very basic. I apologize if it seems kind of a little too basic, but we just want to make sure everybody's on the same page and knows what we're talking about. We're using the same terms. So, the first slide is going to look really familiar from a couple weeks ago. With a little bit more detail, and that is just what an essay looks like. So in the previous presentation, I just wanted you to know that there should be paragraphs in a college essay. To be a little bit more sophisticated about that, we're breaking down what the parts are so that we understand what we're talking about today. So you begin with an introduction paragraph, usually not more than one unless it's a very long paper. And that introduction paragraph introduces, gets attention. We talked about the funnel paragraph last week. This idea that it kind of creates context, lets the reader know what the topic is generally, and then narrows into that specific thesis. And of course ends in the thesis statement. Let's jump ahead down to the conclusion. Conclusions work a lot like introductions in that they're sort of special ending paragraphs, usually not more than one. But that kind of wraps up your argument, restates key ideas, points to implications of what you're arguing, brings closure to the argument. So again, those are kind of special paragraphs, and then everything in between, and that can be anywhere from 2 in like a one-page essay to 200 body paragraphs, depending on how long your paper is. Again, I want to break you out of this idea that all essays have 3 body paragraphs. Sometimes they do, but the odds that they always do are starkly low. So, again, that's just the visual. The content of this is not important. It's just sort of what we're talking about when we talk about the parts of an essay. So again, introductions and conclusions have special functions in essays, and therefore they have special structure and expectations. They don't look like body paragraphs. You don't start an introduction with a topic sentence, for example. Your book did a good job of sort of reviewing strategies for introductions and conclusions, and I don't have a whole lot to add to that. We may talk about it at a future time. Specifically, things not to do in introductions and conclusions. Basically, what you don't want to do is be cliche, starting with a definition or, you know, a quote from some major historical figure. These are very kind of overused, trite kinds of introductions. And in general, starting your conclusion with the words "in conclusion" can be a very trite way of beginning. So hopefully you read the textbook on that. Today what we're going to focus on is most of your paragraphs. Everything between that introduction and conclusion are body paragraphs, and you're going to write a dozen or more of these in the course of this semester. So we really want to talk about those because these are sort of where focus problems, coherence problems, and development problems come into play. So just to define our terms, these are the qualities that we expect to see in the average body paragraph. They are unified, coherent, and developed. Unified means that a paragraph is focused on one somewhat general idea or claim that is directly expressed in a topic sentence or is otherwise apparent. Everything in the paragraph is quite clearly about that one main idea, expressed or implied. So in other words, we talked about how your thesis is the focus of your essay. Your whole essay is about your thesis. Well, paragraphs are all about your topic sentence. Topic sentences are like the mini thesis statements. So everything in a paragraph should be about that topic sentence. So be careful when you hear me say somewhat general. That doesn't mean your topic sentences should be broad by any means. A paragraph is very short. So it's actually going to be very narrow because it's got to be narrow enough to write just a paragraph about. So I only just say general because it's more general than the other sentences in your paragraph. Because each sentence other than the topic sentence should be more specific and detailed information about that general point. So we'll look at some examples of that in a second. Coherent just means that the ideas in the paragraph move along logically from one sentence to the next. you use clear transitions, concrete word choices, parallelism, repeat key terms, things that help your reader follow along the chain of reasoning. You know, if you were telling someone how to get from Parkland College to the Marketplace Mall, you wouldn't just say, oh, take Bradley and then Neal and then Marketplace or whatever. You have to give them, first you leave Parkland going east on Bradley, take a left on Neal, whatever. You have to have those transitional words in between the parts of that. Same thing when you're kind of helping your reader follow along your thinking. You want to use little road signs such as transitions and or kind of road signs or markers that help your reader see how the ideas connect together. In essence, every sentence should obviously follow in some logical way from the previous one and should obviously lead to in some logical way the next one. And so transitions obviously are the easiest way to do that. Things like for example, or in contrast, or otherwise, that sort of suggest here's how this idea relates to the one before it. So a lot of you are very good at those transitions at the beginning of paragraphs, but not so good in the sentence-to-sentence transitions. Repeating key terms to remind your reader what you were talking about is also another really good way of accomplishing that. And your book talks about that as well. It gives you some good strategies for that. So what we're going to focus on today mostly is development, because that's the thing, probably the most emergent situation that most English 101 students have, is that they know how to say what they think, but they really struggle to develop why they think it and really kind of support and illustrate and kind of get at the nuance of what their thinking is. And so development just means that that topic sentence, that main idea or claim, is well supported with specific evidence, such as examples, illustrations, facts, reasoning. It doesn't just repeat the main point in several different but equally general ways, but builds increasing detail and development to make the main idea or claim increasingly clear. So in other words, I've read many a student essay that, started with a topic sentence something like along the lines of, all colleges should reduce their tuition by half because student debt is getting out of control. So that's their topic sentence. Perfectly good topic sentence. But then all the rest of the sentences just kind of say the same thing without going into more detail or illustrating or getting less abstract. So they'll follow up with sentences like, tuition is far too high, student debt is growing, and students cannot keep up with that debt. The next sentence is, it is not fair to expect students to go into the world with an unreasonable amount of debt because tuition is so high. So you get what I'm saying. There's nothing being added, it's just kind of saying the same thing over and over again. So let's look at some examples of at least a little bit of this. So let's start with the unity, because this is another issue students struggle with. I tend to see really long paragraphs, especially those students who are trying to make a 5-paragraph essay into a 5-page paper. You get these extremely long paragraphs, and they're not focused. Focused or unified, I'm using those interchangeably. So here's an example of a paragraph. I've got a topic sentence, but this is one that it's unfocused in that it contains irrelevant information that's not about that topic sentence. It's about the general idea, but it's not about that topic sentence. So I'm going to read through it and we'll kind of point out the places where it takes what I call a left turn, or wangy hordula is my other term for it. That is just kind of this thing hanging out there. So my topic sentence is, one reason that attendance is no longer a valid basis for grading in college classes is the growth of online classes. Okay, that's my point in this paragraph. So everything I say should be helping explain that point in greater detail. Currently, most institutions offer online sections of most of their courses. Content is delivered without the student ever attending an actual class. Students use the textbooks along with other study aids posted by their professor to learn and practice the course objectives at their own pace, based on their own schedules, even though textbook prices are spiraling out of control. Okay, we were doing fine talking about getting into details. Like, well, there's these online classes that are the equivalent of on-campus classes. Students learn the material without going to class. They use the textbooks. They use study aids. They learn the course objectives outside of class. So I did say textbooks, but textbook prices are not, the price of textbooks and the fact they're out of control are not relevant to this point. So even though I was talking about textbooks, I've taken a left. That's a wanging hordula right there, textbook prices. So we're going to cut that. Oops. Ah. Okay, so we're going to cut that. So I'll go on. Back on point. So for example, English teachers love the words for example. A student in an online class might watch a video lecture or review a PowerPoint material to supplement his or her understanding of the course objectives. The credit and objectives for these courses are the same as on-campus classes, which presumably suggests that one does not have to be physically present at a specific time and place for the course to be taught and learned effectively. Okay, so far this is all good. I'm going into more detail. In fact, I'm illustrating what I'm trying to argue, which is that, hey, this student does it this way. These students do it on campus, but the credit's the same. They're supposed to learn the same things. So if these people can do it online, why can't any student sort of learn it in other ways? So that's what I'm talking about here. So I've done fine. In order for the course to be taught and learned effectively. My cousin took an online history course and ended up failing because he didn't really understand how the website was laid out. Wanging hordula again. I was talking about online classes for sure, but your dumbass cousin, not only is he not relevant to this discussion, he almost contradicts it. Because you're saying, well, these things can be learned outside of class. Your cousin clearly couldn't. He needed an on-campus class. So we're going to cut the sentence about the cousin, and then the rest of the paragraph's back on track. Since many on-campus faculty are now posting lecture notes and other supplemental materials online, it should be up to the student to decide how he or she learns best based on his or her own needs and schedule. So again, most of the paragraph was on point, but there's just these little incursions of irrelevant information. I don't see this as often, but I do see it occasionally. So always be watching, just like with your thesis. As you're reading through, revising your paper, is each sentence still about that topic sentence? Or have you kind of gotten off on a tangent? Here's an example of the more common way I see paragraphs lacking unity. And what this really is it's two discrete paragraphs that just got jammed together, like the student didn't notice that they switched to a new paragraph. So I'm going to read through this and the whole thing, and then we'll sort of talk about where this goes from being one idea to being a whole different idea. So if my topic sentence is, students often cheat on assignments because they have made poor choices prior to the assignment and feel they have no other option. So that's my point, that the reason students cheat is because they are backed into a corner and they feel like they don't have any other choices. So that's my topic sentence. That's what I'm going to talk about. For example, a student who has not kept up with the readings in a class may feel that he or she cannot catch up in time to take a midterm and may feel that he or she must cheat to pass the exam. However, in fact, the sense of having no choice is really a product of denial because the student always still has an option to take the exam honestly and risk a failing grade. But to many students, failure doesn't feel like an option because of the negative consequences of a failing grade. Students have various pressures that place high stakes on passing grades. For instance, some students' parents may threaten to withdraw financial support if grades are poor, or students may need to maintain a certain GPA in order to keep a scholarship or athletic eligibility. So again, I don't know if you could hear it, but there's a point at which I stopped talking about students feeling like they have no choice but to cheat because they're going to fail. And so, two, the reason failing's bad. A new point. So right up into here when I'm still talking about how they're in denial and they really do have options, they just don't feel like it because they don't want to have to deal with the consequences, that's all sort of on this point. Right here where I say students have various pressures that place high stakes on passing grades, that's a new point that needs its own separate little argument. that follows logically, and I can, so it's kind of understandable why students end up sort of maybe mashing this into the same paragraph, because they're so closely connected. This point about the pressure students have to have good grades, is this point is one of the negative consequence, or the reasons there's negative consequences. So it logically follows. But it's a new point. So, and in fact, your paragraphs should one logically follow the other. So this is actually a new topic sentence, and then this illustration, students whose parents will stop paying or they are going to lose their scholarship, those are illustrations of that topic sentence. So really all you have to do is indent right here before students. Oh, I gotta stop clicking, sorry. Indent right here on students, and you're good to go. Because these cohere so well, you don't even need a transition. It's so obvious that this sentence leads into this one. But it's a new paragraph. I hope you can see that's kind of, you've changed points. So a lot of times in the margins of your papers, I'll say things like, this is a long paragraph, I'd check for focus, or this. Sometimes I say this paragraph starts out being about one thing and leads to and ends up being about another thing. Yeah, if you feel like you're talking about something different at the end of a paragraph than you started talking about at the beginning, you probably don't have a focused paragraph. And you want to sort of look for places where you can break that down. A lot of times in student writing, you can hear the new paragraphs because they'll say things like, another reason that, or in addition to that thing I was just talking about, whatever. So you even hear those transitional words that sort of signal I'm about to head into a new thought. So even reading out loud to yourself while you're, if you're trying to sort of figure out how to break down a paragraph, might help you kind of hear those shifts. So there's, as I've told you before, there's no formulas in writing, and so I have seen perfectly decent paragraphs that were like 3 sentences long. I have seen perfectly decent paragraphs that were 1.5 pages long. However, most of the time, especially in a short paper of the 4 to 8 page range, anytime your paragraph's more than about 1/2 page long, you should probably be checking for focus. Doesn't mean it's not focused, but it's a red flag that means maybe you should stop and check. If it's getting over a page, you definitely want to probably check. It's either not focused or you're repeating yourself and going on too long. You maybe need to cut some of it. Because certainly, 1.5 page paragraph in a 4-page paper is kind of, just in terms of balance, probably not ideal. But most of the time when I see that in student papers, it's several paragraphs jammed into one. Getting back to the development aspect, I was talking about this idea of developing rather than repeating. So here's an example of a paragraph from an actual student paper that I think kind of does that thing. So her topic sentence is, this article, The Gender of Violence, is very thought-provoking. Decent enough topic sentence, so you know what her point here is that this article she read called The Gender of Violence provoked thought. Okay, let's hear more. This artifact really makes a person think about how we handle our emotions and act out based on those things. I personally thought a lot about my generation and our part in these findings about young adults who commit crime. I was a senior in high school when Columbine happened, and whenever I think about my time in high school, this is also something that goes along with it. I think this was the end of an age of innocence for many younger males and females. We were looked at more closely and analyzed more thoroughly than before these violent crimes happened. So the question I've got to ask you is, do you have any better idea now than you did at the beginning of why this was so thought-provoking? Not particularly. There are some head fakes to development. Columbine is a specific reference to violence, and so you think, oh, specific illustration's good. But all she does is say, Columbine made me think. In fact, she keeps repeating, I kind of emphasized when I was reading it, about makes a person think. I personally thought. I think about my time in high school. This is something that goes along with it. I think this is the end of it. So there's a lot of, she keeps saying she thought, but doesn't really ever get to what she thought in any kind of detail. Again, some head fakes. I think this was the end of an age of innocence. Okay, that's a start at saying something you thought about, but again, goes nowhere. You don't really know what that means. You don't know, where she's headed, how this connected to the article, nothing. So again, there's a lot of words here, but it really stays at this very sort of general level and doesn't really explain in detail this main point, that this article was thought-provoking. I am no more enlightened about what was so thought-provoking about this article than I was when I started. Okay, so let's look at, instead of doing that repeating thing and being just sort of general and kind of staying at this general level, how do you develop a claim? A claim, don't forget, is just what you think. So if your thesis statement is the big what you think, your topic sentences are the little what you thinks that are the reason you think what your thesis thinks, right? So how do you kind of make those many arguments? How do you explain why you think what you think in those paragraphs? Well, there's a number of strategies. You can explain, provide illustrations or examples that show what you mean. Show, don't just tell is one of my favorite expressions. You can provide facts. You can use authoritative opinion or personal testimony. You can compare, contrast, or use an analogy. Or you can combine two or more of these methods. And in fact, most of the time you will. Again, I don't want you to think that this is a formula. Oh, Paula says I need a topic sentence and then to develop. And so I'm just going to eeny, meeny, miny, mo. Okay, I'll provide facts in this paragraph. The next paragraph, I'll have a topic sentence and an example. It's not just one development thing is enough. Depends on, obviously, the purpose, the rhetorical purpose of what you're trying to say in that paragraph. More often than not, there's going to be some combination of these that you use to fully explain your point. So let's look at some examples. And bear in mind, again, these slides they look big on the screen, but they're small, and they don't contain very many words. And so what you're seeing on these slides are not complete paragraphs. They're just me sort of showing you partial paragraphs that use these different strategies. The first strategy is merely to explain. Just say more in more detail about what you think. So be more specific, provide more information, define terms. So you're not adding any real evidence of any kind. You're just kind of being clearer, saying more words that kind of help narrow in and define what you're saying. So here's an example. My topic sentence is, today's average 18-year-old does not have the maturity to succeed in college. There's my point. I'm going to I'm going to develop that point simply by kind of going into more detail about that claim. So I continue. College requires self-discipline, time management skills, and a high level of motivation. So here I'm talking about the qualities of college success that kind of explain why I think this. Many 18-year-olds, free to make their own decisions for the first time in their lives, have a difficult time choosing long-term rewards over short-term gratification. Again, still explaining, here's what I think 18-year-olds are like, many of them anyway, which mitigates against the kind of personal discipline necessary to succeed in college. So all I've done is go into more detail about what I mean by this. So you don't have to guess at what qualities 18-year-olds have that I don't think makes them ready for college, or what do I mean by maturity, or what do I mean by college success. I've gone into more detail, so I've developed that in more detail. Now again, in an actual paper, if you took these words, this is only like maybe 2 lines of text, so this isn't a fully formed paragraph by any means. So what we're going to do is look at the next strategy and then add on to this paragraph with that strategy. And that's example or illustration. Again, a lot of times I will write in your papers, show, don't just tell. A favorite English teacher I said before loves the words for example. be concrete, I'll say. Anytime you can kind of paint a picture, give your reader something they can visualize to help them understand the situation, the better. So an example or illustration could be a real example, could be something, a personal experience, could be a well-known example. So, you could talk about, in times of war, people tend to become more patriotic. For example, after 9/11, many households started flying the American flag. Again, that's not something that happened to you personally, but it's just a well-known kind of thing. You didn't have to do research, that sort of thing. Or you could talk about, recent current events. How Puerto Rico got destroyed by a hurricane or whatever. Those are all fine. But even hypothetical examples, they have to be credible. But, if you think about the earlier example, let's see if I can find it. Go back to this. If you go back to this paragraph where I'm talking about cheating, I'm using hypothetical examples. I'm saying, for example, a student who has not kept up with the readings in class may feel. So I'm not talking about an actual student here that I know. I'm not talking about, student John Smith. I just, as an experienced teacher, this is something I know that happens and that people would recognize. Oh yeah, even from their own college days. Oh yeah, there's always that student. Or your own high school days. So it's a hypothetical or kind of a general example that people would recognize that's believable. If this had been, for example, a student who keeps zebras in his yard, that would not have your readers nodding along going, yeah, I know that's common. So let me get back to where I was. Oop, I went too far. So giving an example or illustrate, a lot of times I will write illustrate or show don't tell in your margins. You want to sort of make it vivid the abstraction you're talking about, the idea you're talking about. You want to show your reader how that applies in the real world. So I took this previous paragraph I started by just explaining in more detail, and I added another one of these strategies, which is the example. So I'm talking about, personal disciplinarian, don't have the personal discipline necessary to succeed in college. Okay, here's the new stuff. In recent years, there have been countless young athletes or celebrities like Justin Bieber or Johnny Manziel who, when given the freedom that comes with rapid success and wealth, have been unable to handle the responsibility of that freedom. College students of the same age with much less to lose are just as likely to fall into this kind of immature short-sightedness. So if up here I'm kind of saying, like, look, it's hard for young people to think long-term. They like to think about short-term gratification. Well, here's some examples of young folks in the public eye who have not thought long-term. They've thought about, the short-term gratification. And that's how you go about the process of developing a point. Again, you're not absolutely going to get your reader to agree with you, but through development, you want them to be able to say, okay, I see why Paula thinks what she thinks, or I at least see how her thinking works. Because then you can have a conversation. If you're just kind of like, this is true, and can't explain your reasons, you're not going anywhere with that. Okay, so another strategy, and this will come into play more often in English 102 when you're doing research, but you certainly have some resources in the class now where even in the course readings it provides you some data or some factual support that you can sort of not necessarily prove. That's why I put prove in quotation marks, but I mean, if it's not an arguable claim, if it can be proved, but you can support arguable claims with inarguable evidence. So using facts or statistics to make your case, just make sure you're using verifiable facts from credible sources. You can't just make stuff up. You can't just say, 2/3 of Americans eat pork if you don't actually have a reliable survey that shows that you can use. So here's an example of this, and these are made up statistics because I'm not writing a real paper, just illustrating what it looks like. But if my topic sentence is, it's not a new phenomenon that college students have trouble adjusting to additional responsibilities and heightened academic expectations of college. Okay, so maybe this essay was writing about why 18-year-olds are not ready. Part of this essay is, hey, it's not just today's 18-year-olds, it's always been 18-year-olds, so it's not new is kind of the key idea here. How am I going to support that? Well, by showing that college students in all eras have had trouble. So I come up with some statistics. In 1960, a Harvard study found that 53% of college freshmen nationwide quit or were dismissed from school for a failure to meet academic standards. A similar study from 1995 found that 55% of freshmen washed out in their freshman year. So again, it just kind of shows this is fairly stable over a almost 60-year period. Most freshmen don't finish their freshman year, and that's just kind of normal. So I'm just trying to prove this isn't something that's, these kids today, but an ongoing sort of issue with young people going to college. Okay, so the next strategy is, and I kind of lumped these together, but it can be a couple different things. Authoritative opinion / expert testimony. So basically, this is just getting someone whose opinion or whose knowledge base is adds credibility to yours. So that could be someone with better credentials. If you're trying to talk about drinking age law, and you can get, you can get quotes from like a law journal or a lawyer, that's obviously going to have more credibility or add credibility to your opinion because you're not a lawyer, you're not an expert in the law. So having someone with just some, the resume to back you up helps. The other is just primary evidence, like with your interviews in the first paper. That is someone's actual real life experience. They're the expert on that experience and they can bring something. So for example, if you're writing a paper on domestic abuse and your cousin was a domestic abuse victim, things she tells you about that have more weight as evidence than your own thoughts about it. Or add weight to what you think. So if you can say, you're making a claim about domestic abuse and you can give an example of your cousin's experience or thoughts on this, that's someone who knows firsthand what it's like to be a domestic abuse victim. Doesn't mean they're the be-all, end-all source of information, but it adds weight to what you've said, and it gives a little bit more texture to other than just what you think about domestic abuse. It kind of explains why you think it. Here's things you know, here's information you have. So the first example is just, someone with a better resume than yours. In this case, the Supreme Court. You can't get much better credentials than being a Supreme Court justice. So if my argument, my topic sentence is, what I think, capital punishment should be abolished because it is applied unevenly, unfairly, thus negating any real deterrent effects. So that's what I think. That's my claim in this paragraph. I'm going to back that up by giving the opinion of someone who knows a lot more about the issue, who's been studying the Constitution and the justice system all their lives. When the Supreme Court temporarily struck down the federal death penalty, Justice Brown wrote in the majority opinion that the death penalty was unconstitutional because the Bill of Rights bans cruel and unusual punishment. He wrote that the death penalty, as it was being practiced at the time, was cruel and unusual because it is as arbitrary as a lightning strike. Therefore, individuals convicted of capital crimes are subjected to undue psychological stress by the apparent randomness of execution. So again, I just took someone whose opinion carries a little bit more weight, or in addition to mine. Again, doesn't mean mine is meaningless, but but you're saying, hey, part of the reason I think this is because this smart guy who's been kind of thinking about this his whole life has said this about it, and that kind of makes me think what I think. This next example would be more primary evidence. Again, sometimes it can be someone you actually know who's a primary source. Sometimes you can do interviews with people you don't know but who are authorities, and they would be primary sources. But there are also primary sources in writing. So a lot of times you'll find people's memoirs or things people have written. It's their words as people who were there, people telling a first-hand account of something. So in this case, I'm writing a paper about punk rock, and so I say, after my knowledge of the punk rock scene is, what I have to say is, the original members of the punk rock movement saw themselves as more than just working musicians. They imagined themselves as heroes of the genre, protectors of the art in its purest form. So that's what I think. Why do I think it? Well, because of things like this. Patti Smith, who was one of the original members of the punk rock scene, wrote a book, and in that book she says, Patti Smith recalls that, quote, "We imagined ourselves as the Sons of Liberty with a mission to preserve, protect, and project the revolutionary spirit of rock and roll. We feared that the music which had given us sustenance was in danger of spiritual starvation. We feared it losing its sense of purpose. We feared it falling into fattened hands. We feared it floundering in a mire of spectacle, finance, and vapid technical complexity." So again, this is an actual quote from Patti Smith's book. And again, this looks really big on the screen. This is only part of a paragraph, so I'm going to go on to sort of explain what, and we'll talk next week, I think, about what to do after a quote and how to sort of say more after a quote. But, I've made a claim, and so one way I'm going to develop that is giving an example from primary research or of an expert opinion. So expert in the sense that she was actually there, that she knows more than I do about what that was like. And so this is her recollection or her reflection on that. So that is the using sort of more weighted opinions version. Then finally, and I use this one a lot in class because if your goal is to make someone understand something they don't already understand, that's always your goal as a teacher, but it's also your goal as an arguer. You're trying to make someone see something in a new way. One of the best ways to do it is to compare it to something else that they can understand a little bit more easily, and then show how that comparison is similar to what you're talking about. This is particularly helpful in controversial or unfamiliar topics where your reader just can't quite understand. So here's a couple of examples. One, my topic sentence is, a college degree has become a commodity that is bought and sold without regard to what it is supposed to represent. So I'm basically trying to say, look, people come to college and want to just pay for credit hours and get that diploma and exchange that for a good job, and they're not really concerned about if they learn anything or get any of the supposed knowledge that college is supposed to represent. So if I'm trying to prove that point, the analogy I'm going to create is of why that's bogus is that because I've had many students say, yeah, why shouldn't I? I'm paying. I should get the degree, whether or not I learn anything. And so in order to kind of show why that doesn't make sense, I relate it to something else. So here's my development in an analogy. It's become similar to the way the Catholic Church sold indulgences during the Middle Ages. Buying indulgences, according to the practice of the time, could essentially buy one's way into heaven, canceling out sin or lack of piousness. Today we see how absurd this notion is. One's ability to pay is unrelated to the content of one's character, and yet students line up at colleges and universities to similarly buy their way into the professional class with a degree, with little regard for the qualities that degree is supposed to represent. So again, again, if you're a churchgoer, you know that the whole point of, sin and getting into heaven is you're supposed to be a good person and you'll be rewarded for that in heaven. And so back in the day, if you were rich, you could just go to the, popes or the deacons or whatever and just give them enough money. They'd kind of say, oh, you're good. And no matter how they acted in their lives. And we sort of see that that's really hypocritical and, that's not how it works. That's not the spirit of, Christianity. But at the same time, if we're using that to understand this idea of buying a credential with a college degree, yeah, I mean, you can pay and you can get the piece of paper, but that doesn't mean you have the qualities that it takes to be a professional that employers want when they hire college graduates. So again, this is looks like big here, but it's just a very short portion of a paragraph, and so there's probably a lot of this extra stuff I'm talking about I'm going to have to explain in developing this point. But you get the idea. One more analogy example, and then we're out of here. So my topic sentence, my claim, what I think is, sports records set by athletes who have used steroids should be erased from the books. If a student were buying his papers from an essay mill, he or she would not merely be admonished and be allowed to keep the A grades if the dishonest paper earned. Similarly, if a NASCAR driver won the Daytona 500 with a car equipped with rocket boosters, he or she would not be able to keep the trophy. Using steroids is no different than situations like these. Steroids are an artificial enhancement that create an unfair advantage and should nullify the accomplishments of those athletes who use them. So again, I just took one thing and kind of compared it to other. There are these other situations where, no, you can't just have help and still be celebrated for your accomplishment when you had help and other people didn't. So why in these situations can't you, but in this situation you can? So it's just that comparison. And then because these were short examples, this example kind of shows you how then you follow up the analogy by kind of explaining how the analogy supports your point. I didn't necessarily have space to do that in some of the previous examples, but again, you're really kind of always working to sort of show more detail, add more information. Every sentence in your paragraph should make your point clearer. Should be packed with meaning that makes your point clearer. And so the more concrete with specific images or specific discussion, very detailed argumentation, the better developed your paper is going to be and your paragraphs are going to be. And good paragraphs make good essays. Obviously you can't just randomly put paragraphs together and make an essay, but just like the bricks in a house, a couple weak paragraphs makes a weak essay. Even if the others are pretty good, it's not going to stand up. So you want to make sure all your paragraphs are pretty strong, and all the bricks in that house will hold up then. Okay, well, thanks for listening. I'm sorry about I'm sure the audio is a little bit weird. I had to remake this on the fly. But have a great weekend.